Brookhaven, Tennessee, was the kind of suburban dream that real estate brochures love to highlight. Perfectly trimmed lawns stretched for miles, framed by stately homes with white picket fences. The families of Brookhaven were outwardly perfect, charming, successful, and brimming with polite smiles. Yet, beneath the facade, secrets brewed like a storm cloud gathering over the idyllic streets. It was early May 2023 when the lives of the Bradfords and Bennetts, two families at the heart of this seemingly flawless community, began to intertwine in ways that would eventually lead to tragedy. The Bradfords were Brookhaven royalty. Victor Bradford, a 45-year-old financial advisor, was revered for his razor-sharp intellect and his contributions to the local economy. His presence commanded respect, but his obsession with work meant that he was rarely home before dark. In his absence, his wife, Diana Bradford, was the community's darling. At 43, Diana was vibrant and elegant, her blonde hair always perfectly coiffed, her smile radiant enough to light up any room. She taught yoga at the local studio, drawing admiration for her warmth and grace. Together, the Bradfords seemed the epitome of success. Next door, the Bennetts lived a quieter, more subdued life. Helen Bennett, a 47-year-old widow, had moved to Brookhaven after her husband's untimely death. She was soft-spoken and reserved, spending most of her time as a librarian at the town's modest library. Her pride and joy was her only son, Ethan. At 19, Ethan had just returned from his first year at college, lanky and slightly awkward, with an affinity for computers and a longing for connection. While Victor and Diana were the center of Brookhaven's social universe, Helen and Ethan lived in the periphery, content to keep their heads low. But this summer would change everything. It began innocently enough. Victor, consumed by the demands of his job, hardly noticed the interactions between Diana and Ethan. Diana, feeling neglected in her marriage, began to look forward to Ethan's visits. He had started helping her with odd jobs around the yard, a simple arrangement suggested by Helen to keep Ethan busy during his summer break. At first, it was nothing more than casual conversation between a lonely woman and an eager young man. Diana shared stories of her travels, her dreams of opening a wellness center, and her frustrations with her increasingly absent husband. Ethan, shy and unsure of himself, found comfort in Diana's undivided attention. But there was something else, a spark. During a Memorial Day barbecue at the Bradford home, the air seemed heavy with unspoken tension. While Victor entertained guests near the grill, Diana retreated to the kitchen for a moment of peace. Ethan, helping his mother set up chairs, found himself alone with Diana. Their eyes met across the counter. For a moment, the noise of the party faded, leaving only the crackling tension between them. A subtle brush of their hands as Ethan passed her a tray sent an unexpected jolt through them both. Neither of them said a word, but something had shifted. Brookhaven, for all its outward perfection, was about to witness a fracture in its gleaming facade, a crack that would ripple through the lives of everyone in its path. By early June 2023, Brookhaven's summer heat settled over the neighborhood, intensifying the air of restlessness that seemed to brew beneath its picture-perfect surface. For Diana Bradford, the days dragged on with an aching monotony. Her mornings were spent teaching yoga classes at the Glenwood Park Pavilion, and her afternoons were consumed with meticulously keeping up appearances. On the surface, she was the queen of Brookhaven, but inside, she felt like an abandoned castle, empty and crumbling. Ethan Bennett became an unexpected source of light in her increasingly dull world. It began with simple gestures. Ethan often stopped by to help with tasks around the Bradford property, trimming hedges, cleaning the pool, and watering Diana's lush flower garden. Helen, his mother, had suggested it as a way to keep Ethan occupied during his summer break, and Diana had readily agreed, grateful for the company. She couldn't remember the last time Victor had taken the time to notice the garden she poured her heart into, let alone help her with anything at home. At first, their conversations were casual. Diana asked Ethan about college, his favorite books, and what he planned to do after graduation. Ethan, initially hesitant and shy, quickly warmed to her. Diana wasn't like the girls at his university, she wasn't judgmental or dismissive. She listened, genuinely interested in his thoughts, and laughed at his jokes. For a young man who often felt invisible, her attention was intoxicating. The turning point came one humid June afternoon. Diana had just finished a yoga class and was lounging by the pool, sipping iced tea. Ethan arrived to clean the patio and fix a broken sprinkler. She offered him a drink, and he hesitated before joining her by the water. The conversation started innocently, books, the summer heat, the challenges of university, but it soon delved deeper. Diana began to open up about her life, her unfulfilled dreams, and the sense of isolation that had grown in her marriage. "Victor used to notice things about me," she admitted, staring into the distance. "Now, I'm just part of the background. He works late, and even when he's here, he's not really here." Ethan didn't know how to respond, so he said the only thing that came to mind. "That's not fair. You deserve more than that." The sincerity in his voice caught Diana off guard. She turned to him, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged. Ethan quickly looked away, embarrassed, but Diana couldn't ignore the flutter in her chest. She brushed it off as a fleeting moment, a harmless interaction, but a seed had been planted. As the weeks passed, their interactions grew more frequent, and less innocent. Ethan began lingering after finishing his tasks, and Diana didn't mind. She started finding excuses to invite him over, whether it was to help her carry groceries or fix her laptop. Each encounter seemed to deepen the connection between them. Diana, who hadn't felt truly seen in years, reveled in the attention Ethan gave her. For him, Diana was magnetic, a woman who exuded confidence and warmth, but who also carried an air of vulnerability that made him want to protect her. Their first truly private moment happened at the Brookhaven Library. Ethan had been helping Diana find books for a new yoga class she was planning, and they ended up in a quiet corner of the building. As Diana reached for a book on a high shelf, Ethan instinctively stepped forward to help. Their hands brushed, and Diana froze, her heart pounding. When she turned to thank him, their faces were only inches apart. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Diana stepped back, shaking her head. This isn't right," she murmured. But her voice lacked conviction, and Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes. "I know," he replied, barely above a whisper. I'm sorry." But neither of them walked away. The following week brought another opportunity, this time at Glenwood Park. A sudden rainstorm caught them as they packed up yoga mats after Diana's class. Laughing, they ran for shelter under a gazebo, their clothes damp from the downpour. The rain seemed to muffle the rest of the world, leaving only the sound of their breath and the patter of water around them. It was Diana who broke the unspoken barrier. She leaned in, pressing her lips to Ethan's in a kiss that was both tentative and charged with years of unspoken longing. Ethan responded, his nerves giving way to raw, youthful passion. When they finally pulled apart, Diana looked at him with a mixture of guilt and exhilaration. "This can't happen again," she said firmly, but they both knew it was a lie. From that point on, their relationship escalated rapidly. They became more reckless, meeting in secluded corners of town or in the quiet hours when Victor was at work. Diana felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, while Ethan was utterly consumed by the thrill of being wanted by someone like her. The gulf in their ages, the impossibility of their connection, none of it seemed to matter when they were together. But every secret affair comes at a cost, and theirs was no exception. The walls of their fragile bubble were closing in, and the seeds of their undoing were already being sown. Brookhaven, with its pristine streets and spotless reputations, was about to bear witness to a scandal that would unravel everything. By late June, the secret affair between Diana Bradford and Ethan Bennett had grown into a reckless whirlwind. Their stolen moments, once fleeting and discreet, became more daring. The thrill of secrecy fueled their connection, but it also cast a growing shadow over their lives. The first cracks in their facade began to show, and it wasn't long before the strain began to ripple outward, touching everyone around them. Diana was no longer the serene, composed figure Brookhaven had come to admire. At yoga classes, she was distracted, her usual warmth replaced by a nervous energy that her students couldn't help but notice. At home, her interactions with Victor had become strained and curt. She found herself avoiding him, afraid that even a simple conversation might reveal the guilt she carried. When Victor questioned her abrupt changes in behavior, she deflected with excuses about stress and overcommitment to her yoga classes. Victor, however, wasn't easily placated. As a man accustomed to solving problems through careful analysis, he began to observe his wife more closely. Her late-night text messages, the way she seemed to brighten whenever Ethan was around, and her growing detachment all pointed to something he couldn't yet define but instinctively knew was wrong. Rather than confront her directly, Victor decided to bide his time, gathering information to confirm his suspicions. Meanwhile, Ethan's life was also unraveling. At first, the affair had been exhilarating, an escape from his mundane routine and a validation he'd never felt before. But as the summer dragged on, the weight of his actions began to gnaw at him. His mother, Helen Bennett, had always been the emotional anchor in his life. Her quiet resilience and unwavering support had carried them both through the loss of his father. But now, every time she smiled at him or asked how his day had been, Ethan felt a pang of guilt so sharp it left him breathless. Helen, perceptive as ever, started noticing the changes in her son. Ethan, once a reserved but earnest young man, had grown distant. He spent more time at the Bradford house than seemed necessary for the odd jobs he claimed to be doing, and his mood alternated between euphoria and melancholy. One evening, Helen's suspicions deepened when she was tidying Ethan's room and found a candid photo of Diana Bradford tucked inside one of his notebooks. It wasn't incriminating on its own, but paired with Ethan's behavior, it set off alarm bells. "Ethan," Helen said cautiously that night at dinner, "you've been spending a lot of time at the Bradfords. Is everything okay?" Ethan froze mid-bite, his pulse quickening. "Yeah, it's fine. Just helping out. Victor's been busy, so Diana asked for a hand." Helen studied her son's face, noting the way he avoided her gaze. Something wasn't adding up, but she decided to let it go, at least for now. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted. As Helen quietly observed her son, Victor took more active measures. Unable to shake his unease, he hired a private investigator to discreetly follow Diana. He justified it to himself as a precaution, a way to protect his family from the unknown. The investigator's initial reports were inconclusive, Diana's activities appeared routine. But one photograph, captured outside the Brookhaven library, showed Diana and Ethan standing close together, their body language speaking volumes. Victor's jaw tightened when he saw it, but he chose not to act immediately. Instead, he waited, letting his anger simmer beneath a calculated exterior. The tension escalated further one humid evening in early July. Diana and Ethan were in the garden behind the Bradford home, ostensibly working on planting new flowers. Helen, watching from her kitchen window next door, noticed the way Diana laughed at something Ethan said, her hand brushing against his arm. It was subtle, but Helen's stomach churned. She couldn't ignore the possibility that her son might be caught up in something dangerous. Later that evening, Helen confronted Ethan. "What's going on between you and Diana Bradford?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Ethan's face turned pale. "Nothing, Mom. I'm just helping out around their house, that's all." Helen's eyes narrowed. "I'm not blind, Ethan. I see the way you act around her. If something's going on, you need to stop it. Now." Ethan's hands clenched into fists under the table. "There's nothing to stop," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen didn't believe him, but she decided not to push further, yet. That same night, Victor confronted Diana for the first time, albeit indirectly. "You've been distracted lately," he said as they prepared for bed. "Is there something I should know?" Diana's heart raced, but she forced a calm expression. "No, Victor. I've just been busy with classes and the garden. You know how I get when there's too much on my plate." Victor didn't respond, but his silence was more unsettling than any accusation could have been. The walls were closing in from all sides. Diana and Ethan, consumed by their affair, failed to see the full scope of the damage they were causing. Helen, increasingly convinced of her son's involvement, debated how far she was willing to go to protect him. And Victor, armed with growing evidence of betrayal, bided his time, preparing for a confrontation that would shatter the fragile peace of Brookhaven forever. The storm was building, and no one in Brookhaven would escape its impact. The oppressive heat of mid-July bore down on Brookhaven, amplifying the tension simmering within the Bradford and Bennett households. By now, the carefully constructed facades of perfection were beginning to crack. Secrets, long hidden in the shadows, were inching closer to the surface, and the air seemed thick with the inevitability of confrontation. Victor Bradford had been working late in his downtown Nashville office when his phone buzzed. A text from Diana flashed across his screen, but it wasn't meant for him. "Ethan, can you come by tomorrow? Victor's working late. I miss you." For a moment, Victor stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. A cold realization washed over him, chilling him despite the summer heat. He reread the message, his suspicions solidifying into certainty. Diana hadn't just been distant, she was having an affair. And with Ethan Bennett of all people, the boy he had mentored, the son of their neighbor, Helen. Victor's face darkened with anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to explode. He needed to confirm his suspicions, to gather evidence before confronting his wife. That night, as Diana slept, Victor quietly forwarded the text to the private investigator he had hired weeks earlier. The next day, Victor received a dossier of photographs and reports from the investigator. The images were damning, Ethan and Diana laughing together at the Brookhaven Library, sitting too closely in the gazebo at Glenwood Park, and, most incriminating of all, a photo of Ethan leaving the Bradford house late at night, looking over his shoulder. Victor clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the papers. His mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? How could Diana betray him like this? How could Ethan, whom he had treated like family, violate his trust? For the rest of the day, Victor went through the motions at work, but his thoughts were consumed by rage. By the time he drove home that evening, his anger had solidified into resolve. He decided not to confront Diana immediately. He would wait, watch, and choose the perfect moment to expose her betrayal. It was a stifling Monday afternoon when the storm broke. Victor had left the office early, ostensibly to regroup before an important client meeting later that evening. He drove home in silence, his mind replaying the images and messages like a damning film reel. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Ethan's car parked discreetly down the street, barely visible behind a cluster of trees. His stomach churned. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, he knew. Entering the house, Victor was greeted by an eerie silence. The air conditioning hummed softly, and a half-empty glass of wine sat on the kitchen counter. Diana's purse was tossed carelessly on a chair, a sign she was home. He ascended the stairs, his footsteps heavy against the hardwood. From the direction of the master bedroom, he heard muffled voices. His pulse quickened. Victor pushed the door open, and what he saw froze him in place. Diana and Ethan were in bed together, their expressions frozen in shock as they realized they'd been caught. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Victor's sharp intake of breath. "What the hell is this?" Victor's voice was low, trembling with fury. Diana scrambled for the sheets, trying to cover herself as she stammered, "Victor, I can explain." "You can explain?" Victor cut her off, his voice rising. His eyes darted to Ethan, who was fumbling for his clothes. "And you, how dare you? After everything I've done for you?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Victor lunged at him before he could say a word. The room erupted into chaos. Victor's fists collided with Ethan's jaw, sending the younger man staggering backward into the dresser. Diana screamed, begging them to stop, but neither man listened. Ethan, younger and quicker, tried to defend himself, but Victor's rage made him relentless. The fight spilled across the room, shattering picture frames and knocking over furniture. In the chaos, no one noticed the heavy crystal bookend that had fallen from the dresser, until Victor picked it up. Fueled by a blind, uncontrollable rage, Victor swung the bookend at Ethan. The sickening sound of impact echoed through the room as Ethan crumpled to the floor, blood pooling rapidly around his head. The silence that followed was deafening. Diana's scream pierced the air as the full horror of what had just happened hit them both. Victor stood motionless, the blood-stained bookend still clutched in his hand. His breathing was ragged, his mind struggling to process what he had just done. "Oh my God," Diana sobbed, dropping to her knees beside Ethan's limp body. "What have you done, Victor? What have you done?" Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. A neighbor, alarmed by the sounds of screaming and crashing, had called 911. Within minutes, Brookhaven's pristine tranquility was shattered by the arrival of police cars and an ambulance. Victor offered no resistance as officers handcuffed him and led him away. Diana, barely clothed and hysterical, was left behind, sobbing uncontrollably as paramedics attempted to revive Ethan. But it was too late. Brookhaven, with all its outward perfection, had just become the epicenter of a scandal that would haunt its residents for years to come. The carefully guarded secrets were out, and there was no going back. Brookhaven's idyllic tranquility was shattered that July afternoon, replaced by the flashing red and blue lights of police cars and the muffled murmurs of neighbors gathering behind their curtains. The Bradford house, once a symbol of suburban perfection, had become a scene of unspeakable violence. By nightfall, the whispers had begun, spreading like wildfire through the tightly knit community. Victor Bradford was still sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands covered in blood, when the police arrived. His usually sharp, composed demeanor had crumbled into shock and disbelief. Officers found him staring blankly at the floor, the heavy crystal bookend resting nearby, its edges stained with blood. He didn't resist as they handcuffed him and led him out of the house. Diana Bradford, barely clothed and trembling with hysteria, was left behind with the paramedics. She clung to Ethan's limp body as they worked to stabilize him, sobbing uncontrollably and muttering apologies that no one could fully understand. Ethan was rushed to the hospital, his condition critical, but the paramedics' grim expressions left little hope. Across town, Helen Bennett was shelving books at the Brookhaven library when her phone rang. It was a neighbor, frantic and panicked, barely able to get the words out, "Something happened at the Bradfords. Ethan's hurt." Helen dropped everything and ran. By the time she reached the hospital, the news was worse than she could have imagined. Ethan had suffered severe head trauma and was in a coma. The doctors were clear, his chances of survival were slim. Helen collapsed in the waiting room, her sobs echoing through the sterile halls. Detective Clara Hayes, a veteran with the Brookhaven Police Department, arrived at the Bradford house shortly after the arrest. Clara was no stranger to violence, but the scene before her carried a unique weight. The shattered glass, overturned furniture, and bloodstains told a story of rage and chaos. Yet, it wasn't just the physical evidence that unsettled her, it was the people involved. Victor Bradford was a pillar of the community, a man known for his composure and professionalism. Diana Bradford, the picture of grace, had always been admired for her warmth. And Ethan Bennett, barely more than a boy, was the quiet son of a grieving widow. What had gone so catastrophically wrong? As forensics teams combed through the house, Diana was taken to the station for questioning. Still visibly shaken, she recounted the events in fragmented sentences, her voice breaking with every word. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered. "We were going to stop. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." At the station, Victor Bradford sat silently in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed in front of him. His lawyer, hastily summoned from Nashville, advised him to say nothing. Victor's expression was unreadable, a mix of anger, regret, and exhaustion. When asked why he'd attacked Ethan, he simply shook his head. "He betrayed me," was all he said. His voice was low, almost detached, as if he were speaking about someone else. In the days following the incident, the police pieced together the tangled web of relationships that had led to the tragedy. Diana, under immense pressure and racked with guilt, admitted to the affair with Ethan. Her confession provided a timeline of their relationship, from its innocent beginnings to the storm of passion and deceit that followed. Neighbors came forward with statements, painting a picture of a community that had begun to notice the cracks in the Bradfords' marriage. One neighbor recalled seeing Ethan enter the Bradford house around 2:30 p.m. on the day of the attack, noting that it seemed odd given Victor's usual work schedule. Another mentioned hearing raised voices but assumed it was a television. Forensics confirmed what had already become clear: the crystal bookend found at the scene was the weapon used to deliver the fatal blow. Blood spatter analysis and the angle of the strike indicated that it had been wielded with force, but whether it was a deliberate act or one of impulsive rage remained uncertain. As news of the incident spread, Brookhaven was engulfed in a wave of shock and speculation. The Bradfords had always been seen as the epitome of success, the kind of family others aspired to emulate. That their home had been the site of such a scandal was almost too much for the community to process. The Bennett family, once known for their quiet resilience, became the focus of an outpouring of sympathy. Helen, grieving the potential loss of her son, was inundated with casseroles and flowers from neighbors who didn't know what else to do. On the night of July 17, 2023, Ethan Bennett was pronounced dead at 9:47 p.m. He had never regained consciousness. The news sent ripples through Brookhaven, deepening the divide between those who believed Victor's actions were justified and those who saw him as a monster. For Helen, the loss was unbearable. Her son, her last connection to her late husband, was gone. Standing outside the hospital that night, she made a silent vow: she would fight for justice for Ethan, no matter the cost. With Ethan's death, the charge against Victor was upgraded from assault to second-degree murder. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy, whose rage had led him to take the life of a young man. Victor's defense team, however, argued that he had acted in the heat of the moment, driven by an emotional betrayal too great to bear. As the investigation continued, Detective Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The evidence told one version of events, but the emotions simmering beneath the surface, rage, betrayal, guilt, hinted at a deeper, darker truth. Brookhaven, once a haven of order and serenity, was now a community fractured by scandal. The fallout from that fateful day had only just begun, and for everyone involved, the road ahead promised to be long and painful. The courtroom was silent as the judge called the proceedings to order. It was January 2024, 6 months after the events that had shattered Brookhaven's calm, and the trial of Victor Bradford was the talk of the town. Journalists and curious onlookers packed the gallery, eager to see how the drama of a suburban tragedy would unfold. For Victor, the stakes were clear: his freedom and his reputation hung in the balance. For Diana Bradford and Helen Bennett, the trial promised something even more elusive: closure. The state's case against Victor was as straightforward as it was damning. In her opening statement, prosecuting attorney Rachel Morgan painted Victor as a man consumed by rage and jealousy. She described his actions as premeditated, pointing to the evidence gathered by the private investigator and the testimony of neighbors who had seen Ethan enter the Bradford home that day. Rachel's words were sharp and precise, cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Victor Bradford, she declared, didn't just lose control. He made a choice: a deliberate, violent choice that ended the life of a young man. Forensic experts took the stand, detailing the severity of Ethan's injuries and the force required to cause them. The crystal bookend, presented as the murder weapon, was displayed before the jury, its once pristine surface now irreparably stained by blood. But it was the testimony of the private investigator that drew gasps from the audience. The investigator revealed the extent of Victor's surveillance of Diana and Ethan, including photographs and text messages that showed Victor had known about the affair weeks before the incident. Rachel used this to argue that Victor's actions were premeditated, the culmination of simmering anger and a calculated plan. Victor's defense attorney, Clara Hayes, presented a very different narrative. Clara described Victor as a devoted husband and community leader who had been blindsided by betrayal. She argued that his actions were not premeditated but a spontaneous response to an unbearable emotional shock. Victor, Clara contended, had acted out of temporary insanity, a moment of blind rage triggered by the ultimate betrayal. This was not the act of a cold-blooded killer, Clara told the jury. It was the act of a man who had his world torn apart in an instant. Clara called on psychologists to support her argument, including a specialist in marital trauma who testified about the psychological impact of discovering a spouse's infidelity. The specialist described the overwhelming feelings of humiliation, betrayal, and loss of identity that can lead to extreme emotional reactions. While the testimony didn't excuse Victor's actions, it cast them in a more sympathetic light. Diana's testimony was the most anticipated, and explosive, moment of the trial. Taking the stand, she appeared nervous but determined. Over the course of 2 days, Diana recounted the events leading up to the tragedy, her voice trembling as she described the affair and the moment Victor walked in on her and Ethan. "I never meant for it to happen," Diana said, tears streaming down her face. "I was lost, lonely. I made a terrible mistake. But Ethan, he didn't deserve what happened to him." Under cross-examination, Clara attempted to portray Diana as the true instigator of the tragedy. "You knew your husband worked late," Clara pressed. "You knew bringing Ethan into your home was dangerous. Didn't you consider the consequences?" Diana faltered but didn't break. "I made mistakes," she admitted, "but Victor didn't have to do what he did. Nothing justified that." Then came the twist. During her second day on the stand, Diana revealed that she was pregnant. A shocked murmur rippled through the courtroom. Diana admitted that she didn't know whether the child was Victor's or Ethan's, a revelation that cast an even darker shadow over the already tragic case. The prosecution seized on this, arguing that Victor's rage had likely been fueled by the knowledge that his wife might be carrying Ethan's child. Helen's testimony was brief but devastating. The courtroom fell silent as she described her son, Ethan, a bright, kind young man whose life had been cut short. She spoke of the loss she felt every day, the empty chair at the dinner table, and the future Ethan would never have. "I trusted the Bradfords," Helen said, her voice breaking. "I trusted Victor to be a mentor to my son. I trusted Diana to treat him with kindness. Instead, they destroyed him." Her words moved many in the courtroom to tears, including several members of the jury. Against his attorney's advice, Victor chose to testify. Taking the stand, he appeared composed but visibly worn, the months of incarceration and public scrutiny etched into his face. He admitted to striking Ethan but insisted he had never intended to kill him. "I lost control," Victor said, his voice heavy with regret. "When I walked into that room and saw what I saw, it was like my entire world collapsed. I didn't think, I just acted." Under cross-examination, Rachel Morgan pressed Victor on the evidence of premeditation. "You hired a private investigator," she said. "You knew about the affair. Why didn't you confront your wife sooner?" Victor hesitated before responding. "I thought I could handle it. I thought, maybe if I ignored it, it would go away. But when I saw them together, I couldn't stop myself." After 7 grueling weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. Tension hung heavy in the courtroom as the hours dragged on. When the jury finally returned, the foreperson delivered their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Victor to 18 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 years. In delivering the sentence, the judge acknowledged the unique circumstances of the case but emphasized the violent nature of Victor's actions. As Victor was led away in handcuffs, Diana broke down in tears, and Helen sat stone-faced, clutching a photo of Ethan. Outside the courthouse, the crowd's reactions were divided. Some argued that justice had been served, while others felt the sentence was too harsh, or not harsh enough. The trial had revealed the depths of betrayal, guilt, and loss that lay beneath Brookhaven's polished surface. For Victor, Diana, and Helen, the tragedy would remain a permanent scar, a reminder of how fragile the ties that bind us can be, and how quickly they can unravel. Brookhaven, Tennessee, would never be the same. The quiet suburb that prided itself on its charm and unity was now infamous for the tragedy that had unraveled within its borders. As the dust settled from the trial of Victor Bradford, the lives of everyone involved were irrevocably changed. After the trial, Diana Bradford left Brookhaven. The house that had once been her haven now stood as a constant reminder of her mistakes. She moved to a small apartment in Knoxville, away from the gossip and judgment of her former community. Carrying the child whose parentage she was unsure of, Diana faced a future riddled with uncertainty. She chose to raise the baby on her own, finding solace in the small, everyday acts of rebuilding her life. Yoga, once a hobby, became a lifeline, a way to teach others and herself about balance and healing. Yet, every so often, the weight of the past crept in, and she wondered if redemption was even possible for someone who had caused so much pain. Behind the cold, gray walls of a state prison, Victor Bradford wrestled with his demons. Gone were the sharp suits and high-stakes deals, his days were now measured by routine and reflection. Though the anger that had consumed him on that fateful day had ebbed, the guilt remained, sharp and unrelenting. Victor took to journaling, documenting every moment of his downfall. He hoped that someday, his words might serve as a warning to others about the destructive power of unchecked emotions. Occasionally, he received letters from former colleagues, expressing their shock and support, but they only deepened his sense of isolation. He knew his sentence was more than just years in prison, it was a lifetime of carrying the weight of what he had done. Helen Bennett returned to her modest home in Brookhaven, but it was no longer a place of comfort. Ethan's absence was a constant ache, a void that no amount of well-meaning casseroles or floral arrangements could fill. Her days became a quiet routine of visiting his grave, volunteering at the library, and trying to find meaning in a world without her son. Helen eventually started a foundation in Ethan's name, aimed at supporting young men like him, intelligent but vulnerable, searching for their place in the world. The work gave her a purpose, but it never dulled the pain. She often wondered what Ethan's life could have been if not for that summer, that affair, and that moment of rage. For the rest of the town, the tragedy served as both a cautionary tale and a source of endless speculation. The Bradford house was sold to a young couple who knew little of its history, but whispers lingered. Residents avoided speaking openly about what had happened, yet the story was always present, hovering in the background like an unwelcome ghost. Brookhaven's once polished reputation had been tarnished, and while the lawns remained neatly trimmed and the houses pristine, the cracks in the community's facade were now visible to all. The events that unfolded in Brookhaven were not just the result of one man's rage or one woman's infidelity. They were the culmination of years of unmet needs, suppressed emotions, and choices made in isolation. The tragedy served as a stark reminder of how easily the lives we build can unravel, and how the consequences ripple far beyond the people directly involved. As we close this chapter, we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on Victor's actions? Was his punishment fair, or do you believe the circumstances justified his rage? How do you feel about Diana's role in the tragedy? Can her choices ever be forgiven, or were they too damaging to repair? What about he? Len? How do you think she should move forward after such a devastating loss? These questions don't have easy answers, but your perspective matters. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Let's discuss how a story like this makes us reflect on human nature, relationships, and the consequences of our choices. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that make you think, feel, and question everything you know. Until next time, thank you for watching.